Okay, we're going to do a quick lecture over gas exchange. Started off with a little marine ecology. Um, Most of the oxygen we breathe is actually because of marine plants. That's something that I didn't know until like undergrad in marine ecology, but always found it really interesting. It makes sense, right? Because plants need CO2 in the atmosphere and they take it in, do photosynthesis to make their food, and then the byproduct is oxygen that get released in the atmosphere, and then we breathe it. So it's pretty interesting, the interconnectedness of everything. Okay, so just to keep in mind, back to concentration gradients. These are gases, right? And remember from the first section, O2 and CO2 can undergo simple diffusion. So as long as there's a concentration gradient, they can follow it from high to low. And you'll encounter like several board style questions that seem like really complex, but all it is asking about this concept. Our body finds a way to set it up so that it's favorable for one of these gases to go from high to low when our body wants them to, and when it intuitively makes sense that they should. And there are several different mechanisms that our bodies use, but basically, it's always set up so that, for instance, at the tissues, when we want to drop off oxygen from hemoglobin, the buffer system and everything, and then the partial pressures of oxygen, everything is set up so that oxygen can be unloaded into the tissues. So hence diffusion. Gas exchange occurs in the lungs and the tissues, obviously. This lecture is going to be pretty intuitive because we inhale oxygen and then we exhale CO2, and after we inhale the oxygen, it gets perfused into our blood, and then our hemoglobin takes the oxygen to the tissues and drops it off, picks up CO2, and then carries that CO2 back to the lungs, and that gets exhaled. So pretty intuitive. These like normal concentrations are good to be aware of because that helps keep in mind what direction things are likely to flow. Okay, so when we're talking about the lungs, you may hear the term external respiration. As I talked about before, the alveoli is the site of gas exchange in the lung, and there's around 3 million alveoli per lung, which is pretty remarkable to think about. Who knew there was room for 3 million of these air sacs in one lung? But anyway, so oxygen diffuses into the blood, carbon dioxide diffuses into the lungs, and like I said before, this is set up so that the concentration gradient can be followed. At this capillary alveolar interface, there's low partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, so that oxygen can flow from high to low, and then there is low CO2 concentration in the lungs, so that CO2 can flow from high to low. And remember, all right, we have the heart, and going from the right heart is the pulmonary artery. And this pulmonary artery is like deoxygenated, right? So that's why it makes sense then that it would have lower partial pressure of oxygen. That artery splits into arterioles, and then those arterioles split into capillaries, right? The classic branching pattern. Didn't know that picture was going to appear there. But anyway, then this capillary, that's kind of good timing actually. So this is where the interface of gas exchange is, the capillary alveolar interface. And then pulmonary vein, and then the pulmonary vein gets dumped back into the heart and then to the systemic circulation. Okay, at the tissue you may hear the term internal respiration, and again, like I was talking about earlier, our tissues need oxygen. So after the oxygen has diffused into our bloodstream, goes back into the pulmonary vein, gets dumped into the left atrium, left ventricle, then to the systemic circulation, and then to arterial blood. The oxygen, once again, follows its concentration gradient into the tissue, and then CO2 as well. It's a little bit of a less of a concentration gradient, but nonetheless, CO2 is extracted from the tissue back into the blood. And then obviously the oxygen is used at our tissue level because we need it for the electron transport chain, and we need it to make ATP, right, which allows us to live. And the CO2 goes back in the veins, then goes back up to the heart, and then that process repeats itself. That deoxygenated blood gets rediffused with more oxygen. Okay, so what is the mechanism of gas exchange? External respiration, internal respiration, simple diffusion from high to low down partial pressure gradient. C, D, and E are all true. I hope I highlighted that. Cool.